Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. Harris Ranch Resort, providing Western hospitality and award-winning cuisine. The Wonderful Company, committed to growing a better world. Comcast, connecting people to the moments and experiences that matter most. Producers Dairy, nourishing one life at a time. The Spencer Family. And Fresno State Associated Students Incorporated, students serving students. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Cook Land Company, E&J Gallo Winery, the Fresno Association of Realtors, and California Manufacturing and Engineering Company. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute and host of the Maddy Report. Today we'll be diving into the local, state, and national election results with 2 local Valley experts. Here to help us analyze the elections, Dr. Nate Monroe, Tony Coelho Chair of Public Policy and Director for the Center for Analytic Political Engagement, or CAPE, at UC Merced, and we also have Dr. Lisa Bryant, Chair of the Political Science Department and Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Lisa and Nate, thanks for joining us on the Maddy Report today. We're glad to have you on the program.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
Great. Well, we'll dive right into the discussion. We'll start with you, Lisa. Give us an overview of the election on a national scale. And this is sort of a broad question, but were there any surprises from your perspective with the national election?
Yeah, so obviously I think, that people are aware that this election, the country sort of shifted red. I think that one of the big surprises was the degree to which that happened, sweeping the swing states and all of them going red was maybe a surprise to people. I think one of the things is that, I don't know if we were talking a lot about this with students, is that, the Electoral College map, if you look at it, it makes it seem like it's this sort of huge sweep and it almost sort of exaggerates the victory. And I think one of the things that people that's gotten lost in all the conversation of this election is how close this election still really is. And so as a country, we still have very divided elections in this country. And so I think that, maybe if some people were expecting, the polls were showing, right, that they were very close. But I think that people expected maybe more variance in the electoral map than we ended up seeing.
And what do you think about that, Nate? And have we seen any demographic shifts, you think, in this national election as well?
Yeah, it's a little hard to tell this soon, right? Because we talk, we political scientists love data, and I always sort of feel like, I resist straying into my public and intellectual space, but I think the early reporting is that you saw sort of a tipping point more than a huge demographic shift, right? You hear about Latino males, all of a sudden, Latinos had been kind of inching in the direction of voting Republican, and all of a sudden it looks like Latino males at least voted, in favor, so a majority voted for Donald Trump. And you see some of the other demographic shifts in some of the minority populations that are traditionally parts of the demographic, or that the Democrats count on as part of their coalition. Labor is another one, right? Where I don't know that we have a lot of good data on the sort of labor, the population of voters, but certainly the endorsements looked different, right? And the lack of endorsements looked different. So I do think you see these markers, and I totally agree with Lisa that it's closer, than it looks based on the electoral map, and yet notable in some of these categories where you go, I can't believe that this sort of coalition seems to be falling apart, at least at the edges.
What about, despite how big the shift was, Republicans won the Senate, they won the White House. They're projected to win the House. Probably by the time this episode airs, that will probably be official. What are some of the impacts on federal public policy that you see in the coming future with all of those 3 branches being controlled by one party?
Well, I think let's step back from specific policies for a second. Having unified control of government's a big deal, right? It really, I think rather than thinking about it in terms of which policy areas are we going to see addressed, because that was probably not going to change very much to whether or not we had a split, Democratic, Republican, government or not. It's what proposals are they going to try to put forward, right? So if we think about immigration, well, they're going to put forward an immigration package that they think that they can push through without very much compromise, right? And especially where the Senate, historically had these sort of minority protections with the filibuster, and unanimous consent caused them to sort of have to modify a little bit, even when they controlled the president and his party controlled the Senate. Those things have eroded to a degree, right? So now you see ways around those. And so my guess is, right, it's that we're going to see these classic policy issues. We're probably going to see some attacks on the sort of universal health care to try to roll some of that back. We're going to see, an immigration become an issue. We're going to see taxation adjustments. It's not that I think they were going to have different issues. It's that I think they're going to try to get some pretty mainstream conservative proposals through those chambers without having to try to satisfy that Democratic base. And of course, in closely split Senate and House, it's still going to live on that razor thin margin, right? Are they going to be able to hold the party together to get the votes they need? And we've seen some problems with that in the Republican coalition, even just in the House in the last couple of years.
Well, I think piggybacking on that, we're probably going to see a pretty aggressive first 2 years, because the pendulum of Congress is that the House tends to swing. So, it'll be unified right now, but in 2 years, most likely, we're calling it, it'll probably flip to the Democrats in a couple years. And so these first 2 years are going to be aggressive. I think an interesting thing about the Senate is John Thune is going to be the new, and majority leader in the Senate. And John Thune has not always been the biggest Trump supporter. He has said that he supports some of the agenda, but he is a sort of old school mainstream Mitch McConnell kind of Republican. And so with some of the newer, maybe further right Republicans, could that even cause a fracture within Senate, which is, they're probably going to have a more marked majority in Senate than in the House. And so it'll be interesting to see what sort of having the older, more traditional classic conservative GOP sort of at the helm will mean for how the Senate operates as a Republican majority.
Certainly. We do have to go to a quick break, but we'll dive into this in the next segment. Next up, we'll discuss some of the impact of the election here in the San Joaquin Valley. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Here in the San Joaquin Valley, we have several seats that could determine control of Congress. And so I want to dive into that a little bit. What did you both see in some of these local valley races, compared to the national trends that we were just discussing in the previous segment? How did the election impact the seats here in the San Joaquin Valley? And we'll start with you, Lisa, on that.
Okay. I think this year, for the San Joaquin Valley, actually was somewhat status quo. So if you looked at our elections, some of the districts that we've had, I think maybe one of the biggest surprises is Costa's district still being as close as it is. But Valadeo, right? If you look at his last 3 or 4 election cycles, it's just been razor thin margins. It's just been really, really close votes. And so if you look at the map in, say, 2022, it was, a slightly pink, and now it's sort of almost white, almost in this red-blue divide, right? Where it becomes not even dark purple. It's so divided. And I think having California once again, 2022 and 2020, people were waiting on the Central Valley because there is such a division in the Central Valley. I mean, we're really quite evenly split in so many districts that it makes for really competitive, really interesting races. And so this year, like we talked about, a couple of percentage points, 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points either direction can change those. But we've seen, Valadeo get reelected, and there's a couple races that as of today are still counting, so we haven't called. But I think there weren't any big surprises out of the Central Valley. And that's pretty typical. And we can talk when Nate wants, what that means for our Central Valley members of Congress in terms of talking about sort of having this unified party and immigration bills and stuff. It could be really interesting. So. Yeah,
I mean, I don't know what the right analogy is. The dog that didn't bark. So I think the surprise is actually not that it the surprise is that it does look like the 2022 map. I mean, in a sense,
Yeah.
and, having talked to a lot of the Democratic candidates, especially in these upcoming races, they were all counting on this to look like 2020, right? I mean, they all those candidates said, okay, we lost by 500 votes, we lost by a few thousand votes, and what I think we're seeing here is we're seeing close races where the Democrats were expecting to have that big boost in turnout, right? I mean, if you just did the simple math, you looked at in several of these congressional districts, if you said, okay, we can see who didn't show up in 2022 that did show up in 2020, right? They can see this from the records. And they look at that and they go, well, 70% of the people that stayed home in 22 but showed up in 2020 were Democrats. So if those people just vote mostly down the ticket, those seats that lost by a few hundred votes should win by a few thousand. Those seats that won by 1,000 should, win by 7,000. And I think the surprise is we're all of a sudden seeing that for some combination of the Democrats that stayed home and the Republicans that showed up, and a handful of minds changed, that promise of this 2020 swell for the Democratic candidates in the Valley just didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see races that look a lot like they did in 2022 when no one thought they were going to look like they did in 22. And I think, interestingly though, no matter who wins in such a close, and I think you're right, Blake, we're probably going to see a Republican House. But regardless of whether we see a Republican or Democratic House, when you have these seats that are so close, from my perspective, it's advantageous to the region. Because you're talking about, the Republicans say it's them, they've got to hold together this coalition in the House. Well, any member that potentially could defect and ruin that has a lot of purchase power, right? They can say, hey, you want my vote on this immigration package, on this tax reform package. I need funding for water, for new water storage. Right? If you're a Republican or a Democrat, that's a popular thing for the region. And so I actually think that there's some real advantage for those skilled members who go to the House and say, look, you need me for part of your big program. I need some things for the district.
But we also saw some new faces emerge as well, some younger representatives here in the Valley. What does that mean for our representation at the state level in terms of having maybe some new voices at the table?
I think that actually there's a couple of exceptions, but we actually have a fairly young sort of delegation from the Valley right now. I mean, even Soria and Arambula are, they're not long in the tooth, right? And so they've been there a long time, but they're young. So, but seeing these sort of new millennials, the idea maybe is that you're going to see new ideas come into the assembly, but I think it depends on how they work with sort of, the stewards of the party and how dedicated they are to sort of towing the party line versus coming in and saying, like, we're a new generation, there's new ideas, we could inspire potentially new voters. But I think, it's good to get some fresh blood in Sacramento. That's always good. They're gonna, be a little wet behind the ears for a while. There's a learning curve to being a legislator and making policy, but I think it's good.
Yeah, I guess I sort of see it as like, you talk about Alanis and Soria and some of the newer, they've only been they've got a long way before they're termed out. And they're in districts that are pretty solid, in terms of likely to be, continue to be elected. And I guess I sort of see it as like they're future leaders. I mean, these are people that are now going to be moving up into chairmanships, that might be moving into leadership of parties potentially. And so in a sense, right, by the same token we were just talking about, right, the more powerful you are and in the institution, the more you can bring home. And these are members that are just starting to get their legs. And so maybe it brings, it offers some fortune going forward for the region where they can sort of use that influence and leadership at the state level.
Yeah, certainly. We're going to take a quick break. Up next, we'll look at the impact on the elections from a statewide perspective and some of the state ballot propositions. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. So California had a number of statewide ballot propositions this year on the ballot. Let's dive into those a little bit. Propositions like, raising the minimum wage and, enacting rent control failed despite, some serious cost of living and economic concerns. Why did, we have all these economic things going on in the state and across the country. Why are voters rejecting those types of ballot propositions, and what other trends did we see with the state ballot propositions in this election? You want to take a stab at that, Lisa, first, and then we can go to Nate?
Sure.
Okay.
I think rent control was, I don't know about you, but I had more questions on that ballot proposition, I think, than any other ballot proposition on the ballot this year. I think that there was not a good public education campaign about what did that proposition actually mean for local control over rent control. I think that there was some concern that it would, expanding it to single-family homes could be detrimental to some people, but I think there was also some concern about, do you trust local government more than you trust state government? And so that could be why that didn't pass. I think there was it needed more information behind it for the general public to sort of feel comfortable with it. Minimum wage was an interesting one. I think that the tying on the sort of perpetual cost of living increase might have killed that. I think if it had had a time limit on it, that might have done better. But I think ultimately people were sort of concerned about changing the status quo or making things more expensive as well, because while I always say there's two economies, there's the investor class economy, and so when you hear about the economy doing well, that's a different group of people than sort of pocketbook voters, right? And what are they feeling at the pump? What are they feeling at, the grocery store? And for those people thinking about going out to eat and things becoming more expensive, I think that was sort of a deciding factor on those propositions.
Nate, what do you think?
Does anyone know? I mean, I sometimes think, on these propositions,
looking into your crystal
right?
balls.
Yeah. I mean, I just mean, I think she makes great points, and I think these are all as good a sort of intel as we might have. But I think the reality is that the propositions are so complicated, and there's such a diverse population of people that are processing what that might mean, that I tend to think that things push the sort of move the needle on these things in ways that, like, it doesn't take very much wind to blow them sometimes. And I think, on something like minimum wage, for example, part of the question is, are voters interpreting this through the lens of increasing inflation, right? If we raise minimum wage, we increase inflation. Inflation's this big, are they interpreting it in the context of their own pocketbook because they're voters who might, be subject to the minimum wage, but a lot of voters aren't, right? And so are they small business owners or business owners that look at their own bottom line?
I mean, is it something that the legislature is sort of punting responsibility on when it comes to some of these? Is it more, special interests trying to get something accomplished on the ballot? Why do we see these propositions emerge on our ballot from time to time?
Well, I think both of those things happen, right? So if we think back to like the kidney dialysis one, which every year was like, why are we voting on this, right? Yeah. We're not medical experts, we don't know. Yeah. I think that's a special interest group getting something on the ballot. I think you get other things where definitely the state legislature doesn't want to tackle it, and so they put it on the ballot. So having the different paths to get stuff there, you get both of those, a combination.
And I think, this is precisely sort of to the point, which is, it's very opaque who's behind this, right? I mean, in terms of, sure, you can look and you can figure it out, and even in the sort of informational pamphlet, I suppose there's sort of okay, well, here's who for and against it, but even that doesn't really tell the story a lot of times. And I think, the answer is that even if the legislature doesn't want to deal with it, there's someone who does, and someone who thinks this is the best route to get this policy. And it's probably not just because, hey, we should ask the voters. What do they think? This is not the answer. So, immediately you're a little suspicious as a voter, I think.
Absolutely. We're going to take another quick break. Up next, we'll look at some of the challenges and speculate more on the future of the elections. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. So both of you work very closely with students at UC Merced and at Fresno State. What did we see when it came to young people voting this election? How did they vote? Did they turn out? And are we seeing, this sort of group activated for future elections, in 2 to 4 years, or is it still sort of a challenge to get young people activated and get them turned out to vote?
Yeah, young people don't vote. I mean, I don't mean to be overly flip about it, but the truth is that, with few exceptions, right, the population of potential voters in that sort of 18 to maybe 23, 25 range, they only vote under certain special conditions, right? You see in 2008, right, this pretty big swell in the Obama election, and there's sort of clearly a nerve hit there where they're excited and they get mobilized. But in general, right, young people are passionate when you ask them about politics. Those that are in college often, many of them are sort of willing to talk and be spirited about it. But the truth is that most of the time young people just don't show up in force. And this election doesn't seem to be much different than that. In fact, overall, it's a fairly low turnout election, and I would say when all's said and done, my guess is it'll be maybe even lower than 2020, certainly lower than 2016 in terms of that population.
Yeah, I was going to say it felt very, enthusiasm felt very different sort of on campus and among students. I don't know about you, but 2018 and 2020, there was sort of almost a sense of urgency among them. There was sort of an eagerness. Even we would have teach-ins about how do you fill out your ballot, what are these questions, what does a yes mean, what does a no mean? And attendance this year was pretty sparse. And so, I don't know, our vote center was busy, but I don't think it was students that were there for the most part. I think it was community members. So that's interesting.
Looking ahead, maybe some other challenges. We've seen a number of threats come against, county clerks, election officials here, not only in the state, but also here in the Valley just very recently. Why is this concerning, and do we sort of see this being a problem in the future, and how can we prevent it as a society, as a community, from happening moving forward?
Yeah, so this is what my Carnegie research is about threats to election officials. So about 2/3 of election officials have had some sort of threat since 2022. Here in Kern County, in the Central Valley, Kern County had a bomb threat recently while they're counting ballots. All of this is disruption, right? And so if you can cause disruption, then it also allows you to sort of sow seeds of doubt about whether or not elections are being run well. So I think I would say one of the big concerns we have is, well, one, we want good public servants, and we want people who are dedicated to being good bureaucrats to do these jobs. And it makes it less appealing for people to want to enter these professions when they think that they might be the targets of threats or violence. But the other thing is that we should want people to feel secure in our elections and have confidence that the elections are being run well. And when these sorts of things happen, when there's a disruption to counting, when people have to evacuate buildings, there's concerns about ballots being left alone, that can cause doubt among voters. And so I think that those are both reasons that we should be concerned about these kinds of activities.
I do want to touch on this really quick. People are already speculating about the next election, right? The day after the election happens, the next election begins. What can we expect in 2026 going forward? Do we think that there will be sort of a reversal and maybe a check on the administration that typically happens? What do you think in just a few short seconds, Lisa?
I think it depends sort of what policies get pushed and what policies get passed in these next 2 years. For better or worse, sort of anger and frustration motivates people. And so that if people are not satisfied with the administration in those first 2 years, we should probably see a swell in turnout. I don't know if you want to add. You're the congressperson.
Only that I think, we had hints of maybe a realigning election here where there's sort of odd, some unusual bedfellows in terms of the coalition. And I think that we might see that that's going to play out further in this next cycle. I'm excited to see how that plays.
Great. Well, Lisa, Nate, thank you both for being on the Maddy Report today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit maddyinstitute.com. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.